Okay, welcome to our discussion on developmental psych, and we're going to first subdivide it into first sort of few years, probably up through age 12, let's say. So infancy and childhood. And first, let's just to sort of clarify developmental psych. This is something we'll be talking over the next few days about. Um, we're going to get into infancy and childhood and adolescence and then adulthood. So what it is the study of how the way that we think and feel and behave changes as we get older. So again, that's the sort of subsection of psychology called developmental psychology. And let's first get into sort of discussing um, the big question that that will keep coming up in developmental psych, but also appears throughout a lot of areas of psychology. For example, abnormal psychology. If you want to know, for example, to what degree is your being um, developing schizophrenia genetic or environmentally triggered, right? So that's a question. That's what we have up here in A, meaning nature versus nurture. That's the question of nature meaning genetic and nurture meaning environmentally or learned triggered. And we're always going to be asking this kind of question: what is the relative contribution of each to any given condition? And we'll talk about ways to ascertain that formula or that ratio in a few minutes. Um, let's first talk about one of the earliest experiments on. And this happens to be on the contribution of genetics to intelligence. And this was a study by Tyron with mice. And what he did was he had mice run through a maze. Excuse me. And the had the mice run through the maze, and then he separated them out into the ones that went through, figured the maze out the quickest, and the ones who took the longest, right? And what he called them was the brightest versus the bright ones versus the dull ones. And so the bright ones he would separate into, their own little group, and the dull ones in their own little group. Then what he did was he had the bright ones and the dull ones run through the maze again. And then he took the ones from the bright group, he took the ones that did the fastest of that group and separated those like maybe into the bright two, or the ultra bright, right, the bright next generation. And the bright ones who were the slowest in that bright group, he would separate those out into the slower, right? And same thing with the dull rats. He would take the ones who were the fastest in the dull rats, separate those out, and the slowest dull rats, he would separate them out. And what happened over time, over many, many generations, was that when you and by the way, I should say, the reason he separated them out is because he wanted only the bright ones, right, to breed within themselves. And the dull ones were only allowed to breed within themselves. And what he did was, by keep separating them out, what he was doing is he's further refining the brightness and the dullness of each group. And so what happens over a period of generations, and many, many generations, is that the difference between the times between the bright group, the first bright group, and the dull group, and then the next bright group and the dull group, and so on, got bigger and bigger. And what he's saying then, he's saying that that's evidence that the ability, and in this case he's calling brightness or dullness, and basically meaning intelligence as measured by speed by which you can figure out the maze. That ability, he says, by further refining them on the basis of that ability, he's saying that is transmitted through genetics, and by having them only breed within themselves, You're further sort of refining and perfecting that ability. And the ones who didn't have that, right, the dull group, and you're taking them and making them, the dull ones, even duller and even duller. You're further bringing them away from, right? Their times get slower and slower, whereas the bright ones are getting faster and faster. So he says again that that is evidence for the genetic contribution of to intelligence. Now, and we'll come back and talk about that. And earlier, actually, in our earlier lecture, we talked about intelligence and its genetic contribution, and that was something that researchers discovered much later. The Tyron experiment is kind of an early experiment, kind of a crude experiment, an animal analogy. But the research that we talked about in the intelligence lecture was research on over many decades with humans, and that was the identical twins versus fraternal twin research that basically ended up showing the same overall conclusion, that there's a strong genetic component to intelligence. Okay, let's talk about heritability. Heritability is this idea. It's basically, if we were to define it, it's basically the genetic contribution to something, whatever it is. It could be alcoholism or introversion, extroversion, or schizophrenia. So the way that we can calculate heritability, got a nice little graphic here, is we're going to take identical twin pairs and fraternal twin pairs, right? Identical twin pairs share the same exact genes. Fraternal twins share some genes, but not all, right? And what we want to do is, let's say we're going to look at, outgoing, whether or not you're outgoing, right? So introversion, extroversion, let's call it extroversion. Okay, so we give a measure of extroversion. There's a personality test. And so we'll give it to everybody in these two groups. And so we've got pairs of twins right on the left there in the identical column, and pairs of twins on the right. And, let's say we have however many pairs. Let's say 10 pairs, just to make it easy, in each group. So what we do is we give the test to everybody, right? And then let's say in that top left for the identical, what we're going to do is you see that little arrow between them. They're each, let's say the one gets a score of, I don't know, let's just say 72, right? And I'm just throwing that number, I'm just making that number up. And the other one, identical twin pair, gets a score of 74. Between them, right, so they're very similar, so we're going to say that those scores are highly correlated. So the correlation between them might be something like 0.92, right? So we'll draw a little 0.92 between them. And we do the same thing for all those pairs in the identical twin pair column. And then we'll do the same thing for the fraternal twin pairs, right? They all take that and we get a correlation for each pair. What the formula says that we should do then is add up all the correlations for each group, right? So let's say there's 10, right, in our example. So we get 10 correlations, and we add them up and divide by how many pairs there are, right? We get the average correlation. So, let's say that, we add them all up and then we divide by 10, right? And we get an average correlation for identical is, let's say, 0.60. And now let's say the average correlation for fraternal is 0.40. Okay, I'm just, again, making these numbers up. So you see on the very bottom where it says correlation and correlation for each group. So 0.60 and the other one is 0.40 for fraternal. Now, the formula for calculating this out, very simple. You take the difference times 2. So 0.60 minus 0.40 times 2. So we've got 0.20, right, which is 0.60 minus 0.40. So 0.20 times 2 is 0.40. That's our heritability number. What does that mean? It means that for this group, right, and for this experiment, for this assessment, and if we keep going, maybe we'll find the same thing. with other pairs, twin pairs, that 40% of extroversion is due to genetics. Okay, so that's what heritability means in this situation. Okay, so it's not really, it's we talk about genetics and so on. It can get really hairy, but this is a nice, simple way of calculating heritability, the degree to which a particular characteristic is genetically influenced. Okay, let's talk a little bit about development before birth. You probably have seen, expectant mothers, talking to their babies and maybe even playing music for their babies, and in the hopes of maybe helping the babies, just pick up some of that stuff. And there's some many years ago there was a study that said that if you play, now this is for I believe this is the study that said that if you play classical music for babies, new babies, that it helps their brain development, and it'll help them, the brain develop faster, and therefore the kids will get smarter. They'll be little prodigies. They'll be little geniuses. And so a lot of companies jumped on that bandwagon, and it turns out that research was quite inaccurate, but not before a lot of people thought, got into the popular culture. So our basic question is, what do babies, or can babies even perceive anything while they're still in the womb? And this is a question that DeCasper was asking. In the DeCasper experiment, what he had the mothers do, these are mothers that were, I believe, in their third trimester. He would have them read a book out loud for a half hour every night for 2 weeks. And these were 16 mothers, and they were all equally, farther along. Read the same book, same passage, for 30 minutes for 2 weeks. Then, after they had their baby, now the question is, how, now we want to find out, does the baby recognize this information, right? If we're thinking that, if we're assuming that the baby accurately perceived the mom reading this particular thing, we want to have a way to have the baby tell us, and that yes, I did recognize it, and I'm not just responding to anything that you're playing for me. I'm responding specifically to mom's voice and to the thing that she read to me. Now you're saying probably to yourself, how are you going to get a brand new baby to tell you that, right? I mean, it can't fill out a survey. And this is the kind of the clever solution that DeCasper came up with. He hooked up a pacifier to some wires that controlled a cassette deck. There used to be these things called cassettes a long time ago. And there were many cassettes. And depending on the speed with which the baby sucked on the pacifier, a certain cassette would play. And the baby had headphones. We put the headphones on the baby. And what the baby quickly learned was that, hey, if I suck a certain speed on this thing, I hear this certain thing. But if I suck faster, then I hear something different. If I suck slower, I hear something different entirely. And there were, I want to say there were 3 or 4 different tapes. So you had one of mom reading the thing that she read, one of mom reading something completely different that the baby had never heard before, one of dad reading the book that mom had read, right? And another one of a completely different woman reading the book that mom had read. And the question is, what do the babies prefer to listen to? And the results showed that 13 out of the 16 women the babies, 13 out of 16 babies, showed a clear preference for listening to mom's voice reading the book that she read every night for 2 weeks. So this research suggests that yes, babies can perceive stimuli in the womb and can make some fairly interesting distinctions, right? That not only can they distinguish between male voices and female voices, but they can distinguish between the cadence of certain kinds of messages, the things that they're hearing, the word patterns. So very fascinating research, but it's certainly not the case. Researchers have not found that any evidence for this whole thing of if we play classical music, that's going to make them any kind of smarter or geniuses in that as that one study showed earlier. Now let's talk a little bit about once the babies come out of the womb, what can they perceive and prefer to look at? I mean, the habituation, an organism learns that something is no longer novel or interesting or new. So this is something that's in recovery, is where you recover the attention of the organism, right? So let's say I show a baby a little teddy bear, and for a little while, what I'll do is I'll pass over its field of vision. So it's laying on its back, and I'll pass it from left to right, from far left to right, and it's sort of floating over its head, right, going from left to right. And what a baby will do usually for something new and interesting, it'll track it with its eyes or its head. It'll follow it. We kind of watch it from going from left to right. And then if I go from right to left, it'll do the same thing. But once there's a point at which, and it's different for different babies and different stimuli, the baby learns, you know what, I've seen this. I'm kind of tired of this. I'm used to this. Well, the point at which the baby becomes used to something, it's no longer novel. It doesn't catch its attention anymore. Then it stops tracking the object, right? So we've lost its attention. The baby kind of does its own thing. It's kind of looking at something else. You're passing the teddy bear over, and the baby doesn't really care. Now, with recovery, what recovery is basically our attempt to recover the attention of the baby. So we can do that by basically passing something completely new over its field of vision. So let's get a different toy or some kind of different object and pass that over its field of vision. And then this is something the baby's never seen. And the baby's saying to itself, wow, this is new and interesting and exciting. I've never seen this before. I want to track this. What we've done is we recovered the baby's attention. Okay, so knowing that, now let's talk a little bit about a couple of classic studies on the sensory capacity. And it's more to do with, rather than sensory capacity, I would say, what the babies prefer to look at. So let's start with the top study by Fance, 1961. If you look at the x-axis, there's always different things that the babies were exposed to. There's a little face, target, newspaper, different colors. And then on the y-axis, the amount of time spent looking at each thing, right? How long is this, and we use that as a measure of interest and attention. And clearly, as you can see, the face-like circle is the one that's most interesting. And if you want to make a broader generalization, it's the things that have most contrast. The newspaper, right, has a lot of detail. The target has a black and white contrast, the lines. And then, of course, the face. And the simple plain colors, those are not really interesting. A while back, on the show Cheers, Frasier and Lilith, who were psychologists, had a kid, and they made their whole nursery black and white checkers and stripes, and people were like, wow, that's kind of odd. Why is that? And they're saying, based on this kind of research, that the brain of the baby, and specifically the visual cortex, is stimulated by sharp contrasts. you promote growth in the visual system by those sharp contrasts. And it's what the babies prefer to look at. Grabs their attention. Okay, now let's flip down to Johnson's study. If Johnson was kind of going off the some of this earlier research and saying, well, okay, is it really that it has to look like a face, or could it be if we mixed up all the features of the face, as in the middle, this little light bulb here in the middle, where it looks like all the eyes and then the eyebrows and the mouth and the nose, they're all jumbled up. But it should be just as interesting, right? If it's just the features in a random order that are interesting, that would be, of course, informative to us. But also, what Johnson's trying to find out is, does it have to look like a face? That's the thing that really, grabs the most attention. And as you can see on the results, with eye movement and head movement tracking, that yes, it appears to be the case that babies still prefer to look like at face-like forms. But it's not, if you look at the middle one, right, with all the different features jumbled up, it's not quite that different, right? It's not that much greater than the jumbled up one. So again, what an evolutionary biologist or psychologist would say is that this is adaptive. Both of these studies make sense evolutionarily, because what it says is that babies have evolved, humans have evolved, to show a preference for looking at their caregiver's face. And that's good. That's an adaptive thing, because it's showing that, hey, I want to try to grab their attention, my caregiver's attention, by locking in my eye contact with their eye contact, and so that they can see me and I can express that I have a need, right? Whatever it is, I'm tired, I'm hungry, whatever. And the ones that can do that and get their needs met the best are the ones that are most likely to survive. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about another classic study by Rosenwig. This is a great study. I really like this one. Rosenwig had mice raised in in different conditions. Some mice from birth were raised by themselves in just a plain cage, nothing in it. Some other mice were raised with a whole bunch of other mice, and he had different versions of this, but I'm just going to take the kind of extreme ends, with a lot of mice in kind of like a Disneyland, big, huge cage environment where they had tubes and little pools and wheels and all kinds of things to run up and run down, and right, all kinds of what we might call a rich environment. Lots of things to stimulate your brain. And then afterward, they would, after they got to be a certain age, he would kill the mice and do a little autopsy basically on their brain, and found that, and maybe not surprising, the mice that were raised by themselves had much smaller brains. They were not as heavy compared to the ones who were in the rich environment. And they had fewer synaptic connections. So again, going to the ones who were in the rich environment, they had thicker brains, bigger brains, more synaptic connections. They were heavier. And what that tells us is that, and it's extrapolating, it's likely the case, of course, for humans too, that with animals and humans, that to develop the potential, the maximum potential of your brain, you need environmental stimuli. It's not just enough to have good genetics. You need the environment to help promote the development of your brain to get its maximum potential. For example, there's some classic research with in visions and psychophysics and physiological psych with cats and their vision. And they raised some cats from birth in an environment that only had um, vertical stripes. So what happens is in that situation, the cats, um, their their what I'm trying to say, the cells in the back of their eyes, right, are developing. Only the ones that respond. There's certain cells that respond to certain environmental stimuli. So there's some that respond to horizontal lines and some respond to vertical lines. So only the ones that respond to vertical lines developed, and the ones that respond to horizontal lines were never developed. They were never triggered. And so when you take that kind of cat out after it's been raised for however long, maybe a year or so, in that vertical environment, and then it's walking around, it's trying to, let's say, navigate a stairway, it can't do it. It doesn't see depth, three horizontal depth perception like that. Just bump into the stairs. And so that's an example, yet another example of the importance of the environment in terms of fully developing our brain. So we need the environment. And that definitely comes into play with regard to intelligence, right? That a lot of the intelligence researchers are showing that difference between certain groups is not due, for example, racial groups or different cultures. On intelligence tests, is not due to race. It's due to the educational environment that you have. That certain groups might be more advantaged than others, and therefore they're going to be more likely to do better. And also, we talked about how the intelligence tests themselves are biased. But overall, if you have a fair test, um, obviously the ones who have the more rich educational environment are going to do better on those kinds of tests. Okay, let's talk a little bit about cognitive development, and one of the things that we're going to talk about in all of the adolescence and adulthood is in developmental psych, we're talking about progression as you get older. So we tend to talk in terms of stage models, right? Certain stages. At an early stage, you're going to do this. Later stage of life, you're going to do this, and still later stage, you're going to do this. So one of the earliest and most influential models of the development of the way that we think, especially in children, is by Piaget. And I don't think I have a picture of Piaget. No, I don't. Okay. So Piaget is a French researcher way back in the early 1900s, developed this 4 stages of cognitive development, saying that basically all children go through these 4 stages in this order as they get older, and that we're going to talk about each of these stages in some detail. Okay, so for the exam, I should say that you should know maybe the age ranges, but I'm not going to focus on that too much. But definitely, you should know the name of the stage and the developmental milestones, right? So what's happening in each? Okay. So sensory motor. You're seeing everything through the mouth, right? Remember, everything in these babies gets jammed in your mouth, and it goes up to 2 years, right? So into the toddler years. Now, the big developmental milestone here is object permanence. Object permanence is this idea that you learn that things exist even though you can't see them, that they still are there. If you look at, and I should say that object permanence tends to occur, we develop it around age 6 months. So when you're 6-month-old babies, that's when they develop object permanence. Before that, what will happen is mom and dad will come in to the nursery, say, how are you doing? Talk to the baby. Then the baby's all excited. Then they leave, and in the baby's mind, it's out of sight, out of mind. They just, mom and dad vanished. All right, and no big deal. Okay, but once you get object permanence, What happens is mom and dad come in, say, okay, you're looking good. We'll see you a little later. And they walk out of the room. And the baby can't see them, but the baby knows that they still exist, that they're somewhere around, but why are they not here attending to my every need and entertaining me? And that's when they get really upset. And that's what we call separation anxiety. That's what I have written there in the big red marker. Separation anxiety. And they also develop stranger anxiety. They get a little fearful of other people. But object permanence is a big one. Okay, pre-operational. Here, age 2 to 6 year, according to Piaget, the big thing is your ability to pretend, right? Representing things with words and images. Your ability to pretend is a big one, right? Like you're playing with your friends and you're playing in the dirt and you got a little rock and you're saying, this is my Lamborghini, right? Pretending, representing things with other things and imagining and so on. And another interesting thing is egocentrism in this stage. Kids can't take the perspective of other people. So, for example, if you call the household and then the child answers, and you say, "Is your mommy there?" or "Dad," or you say, "Is your daddy there?" What the child may do at that age is just simply nod, right? They can't understand that you can't see them nodding, right? And this is, or if you're playing hide and seek, and they're hiding, let's say they hide behind a curtain, and you can see, and the curtain only goes down to like maybe their waist, so you can totally see like them from waist down, right? And they don't get that you can totally still see them. They think that because they can't see, it's the whole ostrich thing, right? Because they can't see, then you can't see them. So egocentrism happening in this stage. Now, concrete operational, the big thing that to acquire is conservation. Now, what conservation is the understanding that because we change the size of something doesn't mean you change its mass. So here, what's happening during, and also child is understanding math, sort of early math operations. Not so much abstract logic, maybe beginning abstract logic, but I'm going to leave that for the later stage. And we'll come back to this in a second. Here's an example of conservation. And you can see on the left, you show the child 2 equal beakers of water. You pour one into a tall, skinny one. And a child that doesn't understand conservation, if you ask them, which is more on the right, they'll point to the tall, skinny one. Oh yeah, it's clearly more, right? Because it's taller. But once they understand conservation, they'll say, well, you poured it into it's still the same amount of water, but you poured it into a tall, skinny thing, and it's still the same amount of water, but it's just skinnier, right, in a skinnier tube. So they'll see that the mass stays the same, even though it changes its shape. Same thing with the balls of clay. 2 equal balls of clay, right? You roll one out and you say which one's more. If they understand conservation, they'll say they're both still the same. This one's just changed its shape. Okay, and the bottom has an example of pennies. So that's a big jump cognitively, he says, that happens during this stage for children. And now the last stage, formal operational, age 12 through the rest of your adulthood. Here what happens is you're able to understand hypothetical things, abstract concepts, logic, right? Okay, now I want to mention a couple things about the model, just real quick. So he says that we all go through these stages. We go through them in this order, and there's no deviation in that. And that some people go through the stages faster than others. Some people take a longer time to go through. So these age ranges here are different, right? Some people might get through all stages and they're age 7. Right? Some may not get through all the stages or may not enter formal operational until, who knows, maybe age 15 or something, right? Whatever. So some people speed through them, some people go really slow through them, some people, and then the rest is they're kind of in the middle. Now, some criticisms of Piaget. One criticism was that he didn't say how people change from stage to stage. He didn't say how does that happen? How do you know when you're in a different stage? Never said that. Another one was, how do you know that there's only 4? Maybe there's 5 or 6 or 8. Or maybe there's only 3. Turns out that a lot of research after Piaget shows that there's a lot of agreement that there's 4. Then another criticism of Piaget was that he didn't really take into account different cultures and different, sort of backgrounds in ascertaining what is normal and what is kind of unusual in terms of cognitive development. For example, a child who grows up around clay, if their mom or dad is a potter, works with clay or a sculptor, they're going to know conservation really fast, way faster, way younger than any other kid. So he didn't really take into account some of those situations. But for the most part, the model still is repeated and has a lot of general support over the decades, and that's why we still talk about the model. Now, in terms of talking about social development, we were talking about cognitive development now, we're talking about social development. One of the interesting things that guides our social development is attachment. And this is the emotional connection you have with that the child has with their parents. Bowlby talks about attachment, and there's different types of attachment that we're probably not going to get into the weeds on, but your book probably talks a little bit about that. But there's secure attachment, there's insecure. Those are the 2 big types, secure versus insecure. Then there's anxious, avoidant, and so on. But I'm probably just going to only talk about secure versus insecure. And while we're talking about that, Harlow did some great research on attachment with little monkeys. Harlow was a famous psychologist at the University of Wisconsin in the 1960s, did a lot of pioneering research on the attachment in monkeys and with their caregivers. He wanted to find out, what is the nature of that attachment? Is it due to something that makes them feel good, some kind of emotional attachment? That's the way that we define attachments, the emotional connection, right, with your caregiver. But he wanted to look at that a little bit more. What is it that these monkeys are getting from their caregivers? Why does a monkey, specifically, is drawn to its mom? Is it because the mom feeds it, right? So it's more of a utilitarian, practical attachment? Or is it just that hugging mom makes the monkey feel safe and secure? So here's Harlow with a classic photo, and this is from Life magazine, of one of his monkeys, and he has these, what he calls surrogate monkey. Okay, so here's a classic photo. On the right, you have something that kind of really roughly looks like a monkey, right? But it's wrapped in, it's got no arms and no legs, but it's a tube that's wrapped in really nice soft cloth, almost like a carpet, really soft. On the left, you've got just basically chicken wire, right, in a tube-like thing, and something that kind of looks like a face on the top, right? He should have had it standardized and had the same face on it, but we won't quibble. And you can see there's a little bottle of milk in that one, stuffed in the middle of it. Okay. What he did was he'd have these monkeys, from very, very young, when they're right after they're born, and he'd have them in these cages, and he would put them in with these dolls. Sometimes the dolls would be right next to each other, and sometimes they'd be way, in a cage. Let's say it's 16 feet square or something, or maybe bigger cage, and it would be all the way at the other end of the cage, right? So the question is, which monkey does mom monkey does the baby prefer to hang out with and stay on most of the time? And what he found was, and this is the interesting thing, right? That the monkeys, almost all, would basically hang out on the soft mom monkey, even though there's no food happening there. They would stay there basically until their stomachs started to growl, right? And they got so hungry they'd be like, "Oh, I guess I've got to go and get some food." And they would run over, or in this case, just lean over, and get some food real quick, and then return to the soft monkey. So what this shows, and I mean, he did many, many, many variations of these experiments. I'm just talking about the main sort of finding, take home, uh, is that the attachment in these monkeys, represents what he calls contact comfort. That it's not the utilitarian. The monkeys are not attached to their moms because of the moms feeding them. It's the comfort that they get, the security, the safety, the warmth, that sort of it's that contact comfort that's the basis for attachment. Okay. Next, if we want to understand attachment in children, there's a simple test that you can do to understand how the child is attached to its parent. And this is a strange situation test. The strange situation test is a test that you can do where what you're trying to do is ascertain how does the child react to the parent leaving and also the parent returning. So, if you take it at the top, mom, in this case, let's talk about mom, comes to the lab and sits down in the chair, and the child has some toys there that it can play with. Now I'll go over to the far left. Secure child will get a little upset when the mom leaves, right, as it says there, and will be quickly comforted when mom returns. But I also should say that a secure child, when, as you can sort of see on the very top, that's a kind of a baby, but when they're there, both, when the mom and the baby is there, and they're just kind of hanging out, the secure child will feel free to explore the room and only occasionally look back at him and, "Hey, is mom still there? Oh, she's still there? Okay, cool." And so the baby will feel free to explore and, won't be feeling like it needs to cling to mom's legs and be all fearful, because it's confident. Now, and then you've got these different types, as I mentioned earlier: anxious and ambivalent. There's an avoidant one. Avoidant, so the child doesn't really care if mom or dad leaves, and they avoid the parent when they come back, right? So that's kind of a messed up attachment. Um, and then anxious ambivalent. They get really, they have a freak out when mom or dad leaves, and they will seek and reject caring contact. You never know what you're going to get. Right, this anxious / ambivalent. And these are the types, sort of the major types of attachment that you can ascertain with the strange situation tests. Okay, thanks for watching our short discussion of infancy and childhood development. And I'll see you at the next one, which is adolescence.